Hello.
Hi.
I'm going to rename myself.
When you were reading in the opening session, you were looking down a lot. I don't know if there's something you can do to adjust.
Well, I think it'll be better now because like this script is double spaced and I've done it a lot more.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, should I share my screen now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Oh, it says disabled.
Oh, sorry. Trying to do a whole bunch of other things right now. Go ahead.
And you're doing the little intro, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, guys, this is it.
I just need to, because I'm keeping my script on my computer because I found it's easier.
Also, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, can I just stay off mute the whole time?
That seemed to work as long as there's no background noises in both of your places.
Okay.
It's fine.
My dad is on a call. I'm going to see if he's almost done because he was going to get off for my presentation anyways, and so it might be background noise. So I'm going to just see if he's...
We have still 5 more minutes. Go to the bathroom if you need to go to the bathroom. I think I might do that.
Oh, I want to do that too. Okay, I'll be right back.
Sorry, we ran to go to the bathroom.
Okay. I'll be right back.
Okay. Okay. How did the session you watched go?
It was good, although like I actually found, unfortunately, it's hard to pay attention because I was so like nervous, you know? I was more like walking in circles around the room.
Yeah, I was surprised by how many people actually had their video turned off.
Yeah. I tried to keep mine on except for when I was pacing. So yeah.
We had like 85 people in our last session.
Oh, wow.
Right now we have about 20 people in our waiting room, but people still have 3 minutes.
Yeah. The session I went to had 108 people, I think. I know. Cool. Okay. Hello.
Okay. Are you comfortable with me going live and admitting people so that everybody can get situated in time?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Please make sure to put yourself on mute. We'll be getting started with session number 2 shortly.
How's the lab?
Well, wait, let's see.
find the pencil.
Welcome, everyone. Please make sure to place yourself on mute. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll be getting started in about 2 minutes. If you haven't already, please make sure to put yourself on mute. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. If you can kindly place yourself on mute, that'd be appreciated.
They use words.
We have a lot of people rolling in, so as soon as I'm done admitting everyone, we'll get started. Please make sure you're on mute. Thank you. All right, thank you for joining us for the second session of the Bioethics Symposium. This session will be talking about working hand in hand with robotic technology, should the human be replaced in war and surgery, by our wonderful bioethics scholars, Shefali and Georgia. At this time, we'd kindly like to remind you of a few things around Zoom etiquette for the session. We are recording this Zoom session as well as live streaming it to Facebook. Please make sure that you mute yourself when you're watching the presentation so as not to be distracting or cause audio feedback. We recommend at this time that you place yourself in speaker view mode so that you can see the presentation next to the students that are presenting and speaking. If you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please send them to me privately in the chat box by selecting, in this case, Ethics Institute private message. And then I will read your question or comment out when there is space to do so during the presentation. There will be times during the presentation where we're going to open it up to conversation, in which time we'd like you to place a raised hand text chat to me in the chat box of Zoom privately, and I will call on you by name, and at which point you'll be asked to unmute yourself. All right, so at this point, we will get started. Shefali and Georgia, would you like to begin?
Sure. Yeah. So to start, we're going to propose a hypothetical situation that ethical scholars often refer back to help us think about the impact of a robot standing between a human and their professional responsibilities. This case is called the theoretical trolley problem.
You see a trolley come down a track, heading toward 5 people. Your 2 options are to A, let it run its course, or to B, switch a lever so that it kills only 1 person. The value in question here is responsibility, and you are dealing with a utilitarian issue. Many people would take the utilitarian approach, which means valuing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. They would use the lever to switch the tracks so that the train would kill 1 person instead of 5. However, if you pose that same scenario, but instead of there being a lever, in order to stop the trained from killing 5 people, you have to throw a person onto the tracks. Much less people are willing to go with this option, even though it has the same result, 1 person dead rather than 5. Somehow, we feel more responsible for this action with the removal of the lever because we are desensitized. The lever helps us to distance ourselves from the actions that we commit.
Applying this to life and death decisions, it is potentially dangerous for it to feel easier to kill or save through the screen.
When we address our ethical questions, remember this scenario and how it may play a role in the results of drone warfare and robotic surgery. Before we begin our presentation, we would like to take a few moments to do a quick polling activity to gauge your initial thoughts. If you could please respond to these 2 questions through the Zoom polling technology.
Do you think robots should replace humans in war zones? And what about in operating rooms?
We'll take about 30 seconds, so 20 seconds remaining.
Okay, interesting. So many of you believe that robots should not replace humans in operating rooms, about 77% of you, and a smaller percentage of you believed that robots should not replace humans in war zones. So basically, that's very interesting because, well, in this presentation, while we move forward, we will explore why some of us may have different levels of comfort with robots in different contexts.
Reflecting further on this question, here's a case study to help you understand the trust that you already place in autonomous and semi-autonomous technologies through a scenario that you are probably already familiar with.
It is estimated that over 90% of most flights are flown with the autopilot engaged. 80% of plane accidents are due to human error, while only 20% of plane accidents are due to machine or equipment failures.
Therefore, during most flights, human pilots physically control the plane for a fraction of the time that artificial intelligence programs take over for. Why is there more public trust in these systems than surgical robots or warfare drones? Is there a difference? Please put your responses to these questions in the chat.
So if anybody would like to share a comment, please feel free to chat me privately. Okay, we have one coming in. Because most of the time you don't know that the robot is flying the plane. That's why we have more trust in the autopilot systems.
That's a very valid point.
Interesting. So this means, do we have more trust when we don't see what's controlling? Like, will we have more trust when humans are fully out of the picture that we don't know that they're not there? So this is an interesting question that we are going to continue to analyze throughout this presentation.
So what do you think now about the 2 questions we asked before the case, now that you know that planes are not fully in control by humans? This presentation will delve into the ideal role that robots should play in society when it comes to our specific topics of war and surgery.
We have a few more comments, if that's okay.
Oh, sure.
So one person said that it's because perhaps passengers assume the autopilot has human oversight, so the human oversight allows us to trust them. And another person said that they think there's a difference because as a doctor, you're thinking about the life on the table, which impacts your decisions as a doctor. And if a robot would not necessarily base their decisions on emotions. For a plane, few decisions would be impacted by emotions. So the emotional weight of the decision.
That's very true.
And
oh, sorry, you go.
Go ahead, Georgia.
Oh, I was just going to say that the emotional value there and the emotional interaction is like a key piece that gets removed with the insertion of robotic technologies.
And we have a few more comments. There seems to be things about familiarity and the success rate impacting people's comfort levels.
Right.
Thank you all for chatting. I'm sorry if we didn't get to you, but we'll circle back to this later.
Yes.
Okay. So moving further into our specific topics of drone warfare and surgery, here is some historical context and background information to help you understand the development of the technologies we will be discussing today.
For my project, I have focused on the ethical implications of semi-autonomous warfare. Before I start by sharing key background information, I would like to preface this discussion by saying that this presentation is not meant to discredit or devalue in any way the sacrifices that soldiers make for the benefit of their country. In my discussion of whether or not it is just, safe, and honorable to the collective nation for drone warfare to be continued, I will not be assessing the choices of individuals involved. It is also important to understand that war tends to skew morals, and this is not a discussion on the ethics of war itself. So, though this is vastly simplified, here are the four main stages of the development of war that are relevant to my presentation. Initially, war was interpersonal combat for which people were in very close contact. Then, weapons became more developed, slightly distancing people on the field as they began to use guns and bombs. Then, it became missiles, planes, and nuclear warfare. After the first robot drew blood on the battlefield, everything changed. Drones, which were initially used for simple surveillance and reconnaissance, were armed with Hellfire missiles. You may be wondering the difference between a drone and a plane. The answer is that a drone has no person inside of it, and therefore there is no life physically at risk on that side, even with the presence of a drone. Instead, the human pilot is distanced from the killing that they do by the insertion of robotic technology, making this a semi-autonomous operation. When understanding the American perspective and the decisions that the military makes, it is important to note that our national strategy for combating terrorism recognizes that we are at war and that protecting and defending the homeland, the American people, and their livelihoods remains our first and most solemn obligation. All national and specifically wartime decisions are made through this lens, and that makes sense. The needs and priorities of the American population are different from that of the global population, which would most likely take an opposite stance based on the destructiveness of drones.
While Georgia's project focuses on how technological advancements have allowed for killing to become easier, my project focuses on advancements that have allowed surgeons to step back as robots autonomously save more lives. Specifically, the robot acts as a mechanical replacement for a human that takes action in life and death situations. In both of our projects, the advancement of this technology has saved more lives. However, when the mechanism fails, it can kill or even overkill. Specific to my project, autonomous surgical robots can inflict patient death. I will now provide some background information on the current level of autonomous robots, and ultimately, I will pose the question of whether or not we should continue to advance these surgical robots. Traditional surgery started in 600 BC, and since then, there's been a lot of advancements that have changed the field from no technology aid to traditional open surgery to minimally invasive laparoscopy and even completely autonomous robotic procedures. The first level of technological assistance is surgical tools, such as pre- and post-op surgery machines that check vitals, or scopes and cameras that aid human surgeons. The next level is surgical assistant robots, which have a level of 1.5 autonomy. This includes robots controlled by voice commands. Examples include robotic scrub nurses that hand instruments based on voice command, the Arthur robot, which positioned a leg based on voice command, and the 1985 Puma 200, which was programmed with directions to autonomously precisely orient a needle. While a human surgeon then took over for the actual process, this demonstrated a large shift in robot capabilities. The next level is minimally invasive or laparoscopic robots. These are considered level 2 autonomy. Currently, we are advancing into fully autonomous robots beyond minimally invasive procedures. Specifically, the first case of robotic minimally invasive or laparoscopy in children, because my project focused in on pediatrics, was performed in July 2000. Laparoscopic robots have advanced from the 1985 Robotic to the most used Da Vinci surgical system, which the FDA approved in the turn of the century. These procedures differ from traditional open surgeries because probes are used that allow human surgeons to make more precise incisions. While basic laparoscopy utilizes advanced technology, the current surgical robots are moving beyond as higher levels of autonomy are gained. Specifically, the Da Vinci surgical system is more advanced because it can change the ratio between surgeon hand movement and robotic arm movement. It can also detect surgeon hand tremors, resulting in higher levels of accuracy. STAR, a general autonomous suturing robot, is an example of the highest autonomy a surgical robot can currently obtain. In higher levels, the robot slowly starts to become more involved, first through tactile means, and then a shift in the surgeon's mindset. Currently, there is no procedure with complete autonomy because humans are still in the room, prepared to take over when malfunctions occur. Until there is a mental shift, full robotic autonomy will not be obtained. However, it is evident that as robots gain more capabilities, surgeon autonomy will be decreased. Moving into the current standards in the fields of surgery and war, there are some guiding principles that dictate what is morally permissible in times of action.
For drone warfare, a semi-autonomous operation, that set of standards is known as just war theory, and for surgeons and all doctors, that set of standards is the Hippocratic Oath. Though these two sets of standards set guidelines for completely different fields, they involve a lot of the same issues because they both involve life and death.
Surgeons take the Hippocratic Oath, promising that they will work ethically to save lives and eliminate pain and suffering. Beneficence is an ethical principle that is part of this oath. It means to do good and is applied to a surgeon's job as they work to save many lives. Non-maleficence is another governing principle that dictates to do no harm. This principle is applied when doctors perform procedures while, for example, attempting to reduce the amount of post-operative healing. Lastly, surgeons agree to respect a patient's wishes. With regard to pediatric robotic surgery, this may conflict with a parent's wishes for their child's treatment.
Though many things about the way we orchestrate war have changed, just war theory has been around since practically the dawn of time. One set of principles in just war theory is just conduct in war, also known as jus in bello. On the legal side of jus in bello, notable doctrines detail the necessity of respect for humanity in armed conflict. Some important points are the idea of distinction, stating that the only thing that the military should endeavor to accomplish during war is to weaken the military forces of the enemy, and the prohibition of unnecessary suffering. At some point, military necessity must yield to the requirements of humanity. The issue with this statement, however, is that it is unclear what suffering must be deemed unnecessary is not easy to define, as one source stated. Also, it is hard to see how any of these principles should apply in this new era where war is unconventional. Instead of war between two militaries, distinction must now be made between terrorist civilians and regular civilians. Because of the ruthlessness of terrorist combatants, the question arises of whether or not unconventional warfare calls for an unconventional response. This response would be drone warfare. What do you think? Does unconventional warfare call for an unconventional response? We'll give a couple seconds for this one.
About 15 more seconds.
Okay, so a little over 2/3 of you said that it does call for an unconventional response, which is very interesting. And while there are a lot of benefits to drone warfare, I'm also going to share some of the cons, so pros and cons, and we'll see how you feel about this at the end. But that's very interesting so far.
So moving out into the bigger picture, some theoretical guiding principles have been written about regarding the role that robots should play in our lives. These principles have been applied to both drone warfare and pediatric surgery.
The first set of principles are known as the 3Ds. The 3Ds represent jobs that are either dull, dirty, or dangerous, and the basic idea is that these are jobs that robots are most needed for. Drone warfare replaces soldiers from a dangerous job, and robotic surgery replaces surgeons from a precarious job that is potentially dangerous for others involved.
The second set of guiding principles are Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics that he wrote about in a book about the future. While these laws are purely fictional, they serve as a reference point for the role that robots should have in larger society. The laws state that 1. A robot may not injure a human being, or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And lastly, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law.
Bringing all of these ethical theories together about healthcare, war, and robotics, there are parallel principles that help to define the way that robots should act regardless of the context. What the Hippocratic Oath, just war theory, and the 3 laws have in common is that they all require the least harm necessary to achieve goals, but the documents are unclear as to how much harm is too much. While not all aspects of each set of principles apply to both of our topics, we have formulated our own set of basic guidelines as a starting point.
For one, robots should follow human orders, whether a pilot or a surgeon. And when they fail to do so, the robots are being used in an unethical manner. Additionally, the technology should help or save humans. Specific to our topics, robots should kill human threats as they work to save more innocent lives, whether pediatric or civilian. Robots are also required to take over jobs that hold back or put humans' lives at risk. This aligns with drones that eliminates the risk of being a ground soldier or the ramifications of performing an advanced procedure that a human surgeon may be unable to handle.
A major parallel between these two applications of robotics is that, just like the trolley problem from the beginning, humans are becoming distanced from life and death decisions. The lever has been amplified. With regards to pediatric surgery, doctors have to be precise and work long shifts while the fate of other humans lie in their hands. Similarly, soldiers are forced to leave their homes and kill opponents to save the lives of their nation. Robots can distance humans from these draining situations, which has both its positives and its negatives.
Before we move on to the next slide, Georgia,
Yes?
do you clarify whether the autonomous nature of the drones that you're talking about in warfare are similar or different than the ones that Shefali is talking about in the operating room?
Yes, so Shefali is talking about a future where there is the possibility for fully autonomous robotic surgery, so without the help of a human at all. Whereas for my topic, I'm talking about a semi-autonomous operation where, while there's no soldier specifically on site where the drone is and where the action is happening, there are soldiers working in Air Force bases in the United States, working behind the screens, making the decisions that the drones carry out. So while they're not present physically, they are still involved in the operation. So it's semi-autonomous, which is a little bit different from Shefali's. And while Shefali's right now is still a semi-autonomous operation, she's talking about a future where there are fully autonomous surgical robots. Does that work? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So these ethical ideals for how a robot should act in these situations are helpful, but though robots can be more accurate in surgery and kill terrorists with ease, the placement of a robot in dealing with human lives is potentially dangerous.
This brings us to our main ethical question. Should the human be replaced in war and surgery? Before we take a closer look at the complexity of this question, we would like to go over some key terminology that will help with our ethical discussion. Consequentialism is considering all the possible outcomes of an action and the ways they may have a positive or negative impact. It determines ethicality based on the resulting benefits and harms from an action. Utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, valuing the benefit of the majority over the minority. And justice is responding to a situation in a way that one is treated fairly and equally. It relates to the concepts that all people deserve the same opportunities. This presentation will focus on how drone warfare applies to the just war theory and the justice of advancing medical technology that can save some lives, but not all.
Responsibility is an individual's or group's duty to something else. It involves making decisions that impact others. In our projects, we focus on the responsibilities of surgeons, soldiers, and even the government. And lastly, autonomy is the right that an individual has to make choices for their own self, which applies to parents making medical decisions for their children and the autonomy of drone pilots. Also, in our presentations today, we will be applying autonomy to the ability of robots to function without humans and make decisions for themselves without constant instruction. The values that we have chosen to focus on are safety, responsibility, justice, and utilitarianism.
A stakeholder is any person or group that is impacted by an ethical dilemma, emotionally, physically, or financially to any extent. When dealing with a case, breaking down the stakeholders is a first step.
The stakeholders in the case of drone warfare are the American civilians, the non-American civilians that fall victim to these strikes, drone pilots, any type of soldier, the military, terrorists, the general population, and the earth, as well as governments.
The stakeholders involving the advancement of surgical robots are the pediatric patients, parents or caregivers, surgeons and doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, and even technology companies. A common stakeholder between the two applications is the future, since the impact is unknown.
Now, here are some current statistics involving the results of these applications of these technologies just presented to you. In 2017, the United States led drone strikes on Yemen over 120 times. In 8 of those strikes, 32 civilians died and 10 more were injured. While it remains true that many militants or people who are extremist and violent in pursuing a political cause die in these strikes, at what expense should we be willing to do so? Should innocent civilian lives ever be a part of the collateral damage? This loss of civilian lives is a major con of drone warfare. Here are some more statistics. In the bottom graph, it shows how many drone strikes there have been and how many ground operations there have been by year. In the graph on the top right, it shows how many civilians, militants, and unknown individuals died in the combination of all of these strikes by year. While drones have made it easier, safer for soldiers, and more efficient to kill terrorists, civilians are dying as a result, and drone pilots are experiencing moral injury, a concept which will be explained momentarily. While the ratios are vast, what if, through strong communication and efforts utilizing the help of the willing Yemeni government, we were able to apprehend terrorists on the ground with no collateral damage, no extra lives lost? The Yemeni government has offered alternative solutions to the United States as a way to stop the destruction that drones bring on their land and people's lives. This picture was taken on the streets of Yemen, featuring a public wall that has graffiti propaganda showing an image of a United States drone with the words, "Why did you kill my family?" Though the war on terror targets terrorists, with the use of drones, many civilians in the countries that these terrorists call home have been sacrificed for this process, leading to widespread and dangerous anti-American sentiment.
Like in drone warfare, errors can also happen when using robots in surgery. Specifically, the medical field is simply not perfect and never can be when considering the life and death situations it deals with. However, the striking statistic is that of all oversights during surgery, 50% are due to human errors, such as a slipped hand resulting in a punctured organ, miscommunication in the OR leading to anesthesia errors, or even the leaving of tools inside a patient. These mistakes are due to surgeon fatigue, lack of attention, and failure to follow protocol that result in 4,000 surgical errors annually that otherwise would have been preventable. Surgical robots decrease these statistics. As depicted in this graph, the overall number of malpractice reports from 2009 has decreased. This is correlated with the increased frequency of surgical robots. However, in a study of 100 pediatric cases involving surgical robots, 13 had to be transferred to open procedures, 4 specifically due to equipment failures, therefore demonstrating that while there is a promising future for robotic technology, it is not perfect. As the technology continues to advance, there will be failures along the way, resulting in loss of neonatal lives, meaning the advancement should be evaluated carefully. So if mistakes and errors can happen, this raises the ethical question of who should be held responsible for these errors, both in surgery and during war.
Therefore, we would like you to consider, when operations fail, do robots have responsibilities? Should robots be held responsible for error? Please answer these questions through the poll.
About 15 more seconds.
Okay, so this is interesting. A lot of you think that robots do have responsibilities, but they can't actually be held responsible for errors. So this is interesting. So now I would like you to respond in the chat. If the robots can't be held responsible, then who should be?
One possible answer is that programmers should be held responsible.
This is very interesting.
Yeah, I would say that programmers are another stakeholder, and they definitely hold some responsibility.
Politicians?
Yes.
How come, Georgia?
Well, politicians are the ones who, well, especially in the case of drone warfare, they're the ones who are actively involved in like the war process, and maybe that's more the president and stuff, but they definitely have a say in whether these versions of war technologies can be used. So they definitely have some responsibility, depending on their level of difficulty.
Yeah, similarly, we have a comment that in Shefali's case, it should be the companies that issue the robots, not the programmers themselves.
Yes, a stakeholder that I look at in my project specifically is like the technology companies producing these robots and what their responsibility is. So that's very interesting.
So a few more comments. I think about the delay, so reading through them a little bit. There's a suggestion that the doctors should take on the responsibility because they're the ones choosing to use the robots.
Right, yes, that's also a stakeholder.
Interesting.
In the case, go ahead, Shefali.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is interesting, especially as the doctors become less involved in the robots.
Is the suggestion that in George's case, the terrorists should be the ones responsible?
That's interesting. I have not looked at it like that, but that's definitely actually a really good point. So we're about to actually go into more of the stakeholders who are responsible for when the unintended die. So let's see if everyone else's thoughts are represented here.
So surgeons and doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to adapt their skills to save lives. This pledge, they also pledge to do no harm, with aligns with understanding human limitations. However, surgeons may prevent harm by resisting technology that is made by those that do not study for years in the medical field.
Just like surgeons feel responsible for the lives that they work with, drone pilots feel responsible for the killing that they do. Going back to the trolley problem from the beginning, questions arise about the desensitization of drone pilots from the actions that they commit. However, drone pilots do often retire with psychological damage from the severity of their work, suggesting that they are not desensitized from what they do.
While doctors' primary responsibility is to patients, the technology companies producing the robots' first responsibility is to their stockholders and consumers. From a company's perspective, their responsibility to innovate is greater than focusing on the life of a singular patient underneath a surgical robot. With regards to autonomous self-driving cars, no consensus has been found about who is responsible. Some believe that the technology companies should be blamed for when the car's program fails. However, others believe it is a passenger's choice to ride in an autonomous car, so they are at fault. However, the difference with autonomous surgical robots is that surgeons and hospitals stand between the patient and the technology companies, since surgeons must recommend autonomous programs to parents who then decide the procedure for their child. Technology companies may feel desensitized from the implications of their actions. Insurance companies are also impacted because if they cover the cost for one person to get an expensive autonomous procedure, the cost of another necessity may drop from insurance plans. This can lead to justice concerns if companies decide to cover the cost of saving some lives but not all.
Similarly to insurance companies, military officials make executive decisions that drone pilots must comply with, so responsibility also lies in the hands of military leadership. However, I am not in a place to question their decisions. Never tell a soldier that he does not know the cost of war is a key quote here.
Hospitals have a responsibility to doctors, patients, and themselves. They must invest in equipment that allows surgeons to save the most lives. However, bringing in robots that can potentially replace surgical staff questions their integrity. Furthermore, while surgical robots can raise hospitals above their competition, the promotion of these devices poses a threat to hospitals' patients as the procedures are more risky than portrayed. Since the FDA has not been very involved with the regulation of these devices, hospitals have obtained more responsibilities.
Just like hospitals create the structure and guidelines for robotic surgery, so does the government for drone warfare. Governments and nations have a responsibility because their communication, or lack thereof, ultimately affects international relations. What this means is that if there was more open communication between countries, there would be less new conflict created by attempts to settle conflict.
In conclusion, there are many stakeholders that each have various obligations that are compromised or enhanced with the advancement of this technology. In traditional open procedures, pediatric surgeons have had to be even more precise because of their patient size. Therefore, surgical robots have been a significant development for this field. Also, the young age of patients could be a reason to advance, since a successful pediatric procedure could result in a long, good quality of life. Therefore, it is important to consider the impact on neonates when making decisions about the future of autonomous robotic surgery. However, robotic pediatric surgery is dependent on parent or caregiver consent. If parents are unable or if parents are not comfortable with surgical technology, then the robots will be useless and unable to save lives without application. In most pediatric cases, the parents obtain the autonomy to make the ultimate decision regarding their child's healthcare. Therefore, I ask you to imagine this hypothetical case. Your newborn child was just diagnosed with a fatal heart condition. There are surgical options to fix your child's heart, but traditional surgery only has a 30% success rate. However, there is also a robotic method, but there has been varied data regarding the success of this procedure. The application of the Da Vinci surgical system on your child's condition could also immensely advance the future of surgery. As a parent, do you have a responsibility to think about the future? While there is risk with the human surgeon, do you think the risk of a robot malfunction is worse or less? I ask you to respond to this question with the polling technology. As a parent, what option would you choose for your sickly newborn? A robotic surgeon or a human surgeon?
About 15 more seconds for the poll.
Okay, so this is interesting. So even though there's a success rate less than 50%, a lot of you still chose the human surgeon, which shows that, well, there's more trust in the old traditional ways. And this is also interesting because the increased parent autonomy threatens the application of these robots because, as I just mentioned, there's a lack of trust in the robots. And also there's other things such as skewed promotion of surgical robots and simply the fact that having a sick child is an emotionally draining situation all threaten the application of these robots.
Likewise, drone operators do not have autonomy over their actions because this comes from non-negotiable orders that come from their commanders. To give you an idea of what the experience of a drone operator is like, here is a little hypothetical. You are sitting in a small room in an Air Force base in Nevada, and you have this screen in front of you. You are watching a house that has a terrorist inside. You have been tracking them for days. Suddenly, the terrorist emerges from the house and you have eyes on the target. Your commander speaks to you through the microphone and tells you it's time to strike. Your hand is on the trigger when you suddenly see that a family of 5 is walking past the house. Your commander tells you that there is no time and you must strike instantly. So you do, and the family's lives become a part of the collateral damage. This inability to make their own decisions as drone pilots may contribute to moral injury, which is anguish that results from perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. Soldiers on the ground feel cases of moral injury too, but these symptoms can overlap with the more severe PTSD, making them less evident. By working behind a screen, moral injury seems to be amplified, perhaps expressing that drones cross a dangerous line in warfare that we may not be able to come back from. Parents, in the case of robotic surgery, have more autonomy than drone operators do. But as a soldier, one places trust that their leaders, who are experts, will do what is best. Similarly, a parent will trust a doctor to know what is best, and therefore they essentially give up their autonomy to the doctor. A connecting factor between both of these applications of robotic technologies is that they can be used to save or destroy lives. However, these technologies can also lead to unjust consequences and sacrifices.
Regarding robotic surgery, not all families are able to afford this option, and therefore these children's lives may not be saved. With regard to drone warfare, only the most wealthy nations can afford such technologies, leading to a further imbalance of power.
Both innovations help the greater good, as drone warfare protects many lives, providing a military advantage, and robotic surgery is more efficient, giving doctors more time to focus on advanced procedures.
For drone warfare, the taking of civilian lives for a greater purpose when those lives could have been the lives of consenting soldiers is a justice issue. Similarly, the advancement of surgical robots that will aid in the greater good, but in the process, many pediatric lives will be lost. This is controversial.
Consequentialism reveals that as medical technology is used, the success rate will increase, although, in the process, there will be a learning curve which will initially result in patient death. And, as drones save more soldiers' lives and kill terrorists, drone pilots are left with severe moral injury, which threatens their well-being and even their lives. Also, though it benefits the United States, it also kills civilians. So though drones carry out the purpose of war effectively, they may be overstepping and through their destruction going against the principles of just war theory and creating newfound anti-American sentiment. With the removal of a life on the line on one side, the stakes of war are inherently changed, and war may become too tempting and too easy.
The idea that some lives have to be lost as part of the innovation or war process may place the lives of future humans above. Is it ever just to place some lives above others? Please respond to the poll.
About 5 more seconds.
Okay, so it's actually pretty 50-50 here, almost, which is very interesting. So bringing this back to the trolley problem from the beginning, the lever is used actually to save certain lives, and now the robots play this role, which leads to the potential for some desensitization.
So what are your thoughts now? Should the human be replaced in war and surgery? You can respond to the poll questions.
About 15 more seconds.
Okay, so for war zones, it's pretty close, 56% yes, but in the area of surgery, more people have said no, about 2/3 of you said no, which is pretty interesting. I guess we do have different comfort levels and different needs in different situations. So if you would like to explain your opinion further, you can send your thoughts through the chat, or if you would like to speak aloud, you can send the phrase hand raised through the chat and Ms. Sykes will call on you.
Okay, we'll give a few people some time to collect their thoughts.
So I personally think that robots should replace humans in war, because then we would be able to limit the amount of American lives lost in war. But in surgery, personally, I have a lot of apprehensions because I would trust a human surgeon more than a robot surgeon. So that's where I stand.
And
Right. Oh, you go, Shefali.
I would just say that's interesting because right now, while the robot isn't that much better, it has shown success, but it's not showing that much of an increase. It's not that different. It's when maybe if there's so much more, if the robot shows so much more accuracy, are we still just going to trust the human more just because it is a human and we trust it more, separate from the fact that the statistics are showing otherwise?
And on the topic of drone warfare, I think your opinion makes a lot of sense because war, when we fight war, we're thinking about our own perspective, which is like the reason we fight in wars is to protect our population. So from the American perspective, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of, there's this question of how do we value the global perspective versus the American perspective, especially when a lot of us are biased because we are American. But I think that's probably the same approach that I would take.
All right, we have a few comments and some raised hands coming in. One thought is that perhaps whether we replace should depend on how easy it is. So perhaps for easy surgeries or for warfare where it's easier, that you can put robots in there. And then CC Wolf has raised their hand, so if they want to unmute themselves and talk.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, just talking about robots in operating rooms and surgeries. Like, I think about how when humans started operating on each other, I'm sure that the death rate was much higher than it is today. And that has to do with just practicing and perfecting the practice of surgery. And I think right now we're kind of going through a new wave of that where we're experimenting with robots instead of people. So it makes sense to me that the death rate for robots is higher now than it will be when that is perfected.
Yes, with like innovation, as there usually is, there is a learning curve. So right now there might be more deaths, but like you said, it will cause more success later on, which is an important thing to consider when we're thinking about not necessarily just now, but the future.
Right.
Okay, we have a few more comments.
Okay.
Staying on the robotic doctors, someone thinks that if you have a highly rated doctor, or if you know the doctor personally, this might make a difference for you in choosing whether or not to use a robot versus a human doctor.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like the trust is an important factor in the human interaction.
And then we have a question about, I'm just going to read this one. The future of drone warfare being controlled distantly actually seems to call for more moral digression in terms of acting with violence more frequently due to its precision or maybe detachment from harming our own side. So this sounds a lot like the trolley problem with the lever.
Yes.
Georgia, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, can you just say like the question part again?
There's no question. It just that the future of drone warfare might cause for more moral digression.
Right. I completely agree with that because there's this further imbalance of power than there's ever been before, in that on one side there's no lives being risked at all, like directly, like no one's on the ground fighting where there's physical danger. So that's definitely, I see there that there's a lot of potential for like moral digression, moral problems, because I mean, I know that war has never tended to be fair, but this is kind of like a new level of unfair where like people don't even meet each other on the battlefield anymore, which is a very different dynamic than it has been in the past. So
we have time for, yeah, go ahead. Well, okay. We're going to move on.
I don't believe that we have time to discuss them now, but we have a couple extra questions. So feel free to keep thinking about what you've learned here today and maybe bring your thoughts to your next advisory meeting or to your families. So our first question is, drone warfare makes it easier to protect soldiers' lives, and robotic surgery helps to save children's lives. Is the use of robots in one of these contexts more ethical than another? And we could take 1 or 2 thoughts on this question right now if anyone has any thoughts.
I think that Jay Shapiro might want to add something. He had something
yes.
connected to this about the precision of drone warfare. I don't know, Jay, do you want to hop on?
Yeah, sort of previous question, but it was a question maybe for Georgia about whether, considering a hypothetical, like perfectly precise drone warfare where there was zero collateral damage of the family in your hypothetical, would that change your considerations of the moral injury if you were guaranteed to get the bad guy every time with some precise weapon?
Actually, I think yes, that's a great thought, a great hypothetical there. Probably because there's no innocent lives being lost in that that situation. But at the same time, something I researched about that I thought was kind of a strange concept was that the drone pilots end up tracking these terrorists sometimes for days, and they sort of get to understand these terrorists in their own sort of way. And of course, these terrorists have like do some really bad things, but they're like, you get to sort of understand like the certain aspects of humanity in someone when you watch them go through their daily lives each and every day. So it's still like a weird experience for the drone pilots, but I think that would definitely minimize moral injury, which that's a great question. So that's probably.
Yeah, if we connect it back to the question on the slide, does precision make a difference in thinking about whether it's more ethical to use robots in war versus in surgery? Right. Does anyone want to raise their hand? Or maybe Georgia and Shefali, you want to answer that question?
Well, something that I could say is going back to what Elizabeth said about trusting a human surgeon. I think that it's going to be hard to have a mental shift in society, even when robots become more precise, because we often have this inner thought that like when dealing with human life and death, there should be a human dealing with that. So I think that it still might be hard to conjure up a lot of societal trust in these things, even that when they are precise. But I think with drone warfare, it'd be easier to make that switch if when it comes to precision. I think people will be more keen on it than maybe the switch in robotic surgery.
Yeah.
There's a comment here that seems to disagree with you, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
So there's a concern that even if you're precise, it's going to desensitize like the act of killing, which will make it easier for us to kill. And that's a dangerous place to be.
I completely agree with that as well. It's a slippery slope, and it brings it back to the one article that I read said that if war becomes this easy and this precise and there's lower stakes, it might become too tempting and too easy. And not tempting as in like I want to go to war, but more like we could totally take this target out with the drone strike. And I don't know if the stakes should be lowered, because that could lead to like more war, more combat. So that's definitely a valid argument and point.
Okay, Shefali, we're about out of time. So do you want to add anything to this question?
Going back to the previous question before, I was just thinking about how in surgery, the reason we may have more trust in humans is just because it's like vulnerability. There's a public, like thinking about like the public opinion. There's a public opinion that when you're in surgery, you're very vulnerable, and like one individual person is in a vulnerable position. So that's another thing to think about of why, even if there's more accuracy, the reason why we may not accept it. And so moving on to the next question, just to pose another thought for you to continue to think about is, what role do you believe these technologies should have in a brave new world? And can they be part of an ethical future?
So we don't have time to discuss that now, but you can bring that question back home with you today. And so thank you for coming to our presentation. Yes. If you have any further questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us at our emails.
Thank you.
All right, so at this time, I'd like for those who are comfortable unmuting themselves so we can give Shefali and Georgia a big round of applause like we would do in person. It was an amazing Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question or comment. You can continue the conversation online on our social media platforms or in your own spaces that you're in right now. And in about 5 minutes, we'd like to see you back at the closing session, which should be in the Zoom link document that was shared with you. Thank you again for participating, and see you soon.